check your after meal number. Not the fasting one, not the one on your lab report every 3 months, the one 2 hours after you eat. The number most doctors barely glance at in a 15-minute appointment is one of the strongest early signals of diabetes complications in adults over 60. And almost no one over 60 in this country has been told that. Doctors have spent decades trained to watch one thing above all else: your A1C, the 3-month average of your blood sugar. It is a genuinely useful number. It's cheap, it's simple, and it summarizes months of data into a single figure a doctor can glance at during a rushed appointment. But an average, by its very nature, can hide the exact pattern that does the damage. Two people can carry the same average and have lived through entirely different years inside their own blood vessels. Research on what's called glycemic variability, the swings your blood sugar takes after meals, suggests that the size and frequency of the spike, not just the average sitting on top of it, is closely tied to the complications people fear most: vision loss, kidney decline, nerve damage, and heart disease. And here is the part that should unsettle you. The people most at risk are not always the ones with the scariest A1C. They are often the ones who were told their numbers were well controlled, while their after-meal spikes were quietly doing damage that no 3-month average could ever show, because an average by definition erases the peaks. I work with patients managing diabetes and prediabetes, many of them well past 60, and over the years I have sat with too many people who left an appointment reassured by one number, while a different number, sitting on the very same glucose log in their own handwriting, was telling a very different story. They just weren't asked to look at it, and neither was their doctor, because the appointment was 15 minutes long and the A1C was already printed at the top of the chart before anyone even sat down. What makes this especially frustrating is that the tools to catch this pattern are neither expensive nor complicated. This isn't a case where the answer requires a specialist, a hospital stay, or a piece of equipment out of reach for most families. It requires a cheap meter, a notebook, and knowing which two numbers, taken together, actually matter. Almost everyone I've walked through this has been able to do it themselves, at their own kitchen table, within a week of hearing it explained plainly. So in the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what that after-meal number is telling you, why routine visits skip it almost entirely, and what you can do this week, today even, to read your own risk before it reads you. Here is exactly what I'm going to cover, in plain language, so you can use it tonight, not next month. Promise number 1 is the one specific after-meal blood sugar range that signals rising complication risk in seniors over 60, and why a normal fasting number, the one your doctor checks first thing in the morning, can hide it completely. Promise number 2 is the simple at-home test, using a glucose meter you can buy for under $25, that catches this pattern months, sometimes years, before an A1C ever will. Promise number 3 is the 3 groups of people for whom the standard blood sugar target is actually wrong for them, including one group where chasing a normal number can be more dangerous than running slightly high. Promise number 4 is the exact questions to bring to your next appointment that force the conversation onto the number that matters instead of the number that's easy and quick to check. Promise number 5 is the single most common mistake I see people over 60 make when they start testing their own blood sugar at home, a mistake that makes their own readings lie to them without them ever knowing it, and the simple fix that takes 30 seconds. There is also one thing even well-meaning health articles get backwards, and I'll come back to it later, because the way they get it wrong is exactly the way most people over 60 are about to get it wrong too, usually while nodding along thinking they've finally understood their numbers. Let me start with someone real, in the sense that she is built from cases I have seen again and again, the composite of a pattern rather than one single person. Margaret is 66. She lives outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the house she has kept for 30 years, with a garden she still tends herself every morning before the heat sets in. She was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in her late 50s, made real changes at the time, lost some weight, cut back on the sweet tea she'd had with every meal for decades, and has taken the same steady dose of metformin for years without complaint. Every 3 months she went in, had her blood drawn, and her A1C came back around 6.8, comfortably inside the target range her doctor had given her. Her doctor would glance at the number, nod, and move to the next item on a busy chart. Margaret felt, reasonably, like she had this handled. Why wouldn't she? Every number she was ever shown said she was doing fine. What nobody was watching closely, because nobody had ever asked her to check it, was what happened 2 hours after she ate. Margaret's fasting number in the morning looked fine, usually hovering around 110, well within range. But her lunch, a plate of rice and chicken she'd eaten her whole life, the same meal her mother used to make, sent her blood sugar climbing to 220 or higher within 2 hours, before it slowly drifted back down over the following hour or two. Because her fasting number and her 3-month average both looked acceptable, that daily spike was completely invisible to every routine check she had ever had. It happened at her kitchen table 3 times a day, and it never once showed up on paper. Here is what that spike does in plain terms, the mechanism underneath the number. Every time blood sugar surges that high, it triggers a wave of oxidative stress inside the blood vessels, a kind of internal rusting at the cellular level. Excess glucose molecules attach themselves to proteins in the vessel wall in a process called glycation, and the byproducts of that process are inflammatory and damaging, especially to the smallest, most delicate vessels in the body. The lining of small vessels, the ones feeding the retina in the back of the eye, the filtering units inside the kidney, the nerve endings that run down into the feet, takes the brunt of it, because those vessels have the least ability to shrug off repeated stress. A single spike is a bad afternoon for those vessels, a temporary insult they can recover from. But years of daily spikes, even with a good average sitting calmly on top of them, like a lid over a boiling pot, is a slow compounding siege that nobody is watching. One winter, Margaret noticed her feet had started to feel strange, a numbness that came and went, then started staying longer each time, then didn't leave at all. An eye exam a few months later showed early changes in the small vessels of her retina, the first quiet sign of diabetic retinopathy, the kind of finding that, left unaddressed, can eventually threaten vision itself. Her A1C at that visit was 6.9, still, by the old standard, fine. Still inside the box on the lab report that gets circled in green. 3 weeks before that eye exam, at a routine visit, her chart read A1C 6.8, no other flags, nothing circled in red, nothing discussed beyond a brief, keep doing what you're doing. What it did not capture, because nobody had ever asked her to check it, was what her blood sugar was doing 2 hours after her largest meal, day after day, for years on end, quietly working on the smallest vessels in her body, while every official number said she was safe. I'm not telling you Margaret's story because she is unusual. I'm telling you because she is typical, painfully typical, of exactly the pattern this trap catches, and the decision that put her at risk. Trusting the average and never checking the after-meal spike is the same decision millions of adults over 60 with diabetes or prediabetes are making this very week, right now, without knowing it. There are more than 30 million Americans living with diabetes, and a large share of the ones over 60 are sitting in exactly Margaret's blind spot, comforted by an average number that gets printed on a lab slip once a season, while their after-meal readings, the ones nobody asks about, tell a story nobody is reading aloud. So let me explain the mechanism in plain English, slowly, so you can repeat it to anyone you love who has this condition. An A1C is an average. It tells you roughly where your blood sugar has been sitting over the last 3 months, but it cannot, by its mathematical nature, tell you the shape of the ride that produced that average. 2 people can have the exact same A1C, one whose blood sugar sits calmly in a narrow band all day, rising and falling gently, and one whose blood sugar rockets up after every meal like a spike on a heart monitor and crashes back down hours later. The average looks identical on the lab report. The damage happening inside their blood vessels does not. Blood vessels, especially the small ones, are sensitive to peaks, not just averages, in the same way a bridge is more damaged by repeated heavy trucks than by its average daily load. A sharp spike above roughly 180 to 200 after eating asks the vessel wall to absorb a jolt it wasn't built for, a jolt that produces a burst of oxidative stress and inflammation each time it happens. Do that 3 times a day, every day, for years, and the small vessels in the eyes, kidneys, and nerves, the ones with the least reserve and the least ability to compensate, tend to show damage first, long before the larger vessels feeding the heart and brain show any trouble at all. That is precisely why diabetic retinopathy, nerve damage in the feet, and early kidney changes are often the very first complications to appear, sometimes years before anything shows up as an alarming number on a standard blood test. This is why I told you the people most at risk are often the ones told they were fine. Margaret's A1C looked textbook, quarter after quarter. Her after-meal number had been quietly spiking for years, invisible on paper, doing its slow work regardless. The mechanism worked exactly as glucose physiology dictates: calm average on the report, repeated surges underneath it, small vessels absorbing the damage first while nobody thought to look. There's also a second layer to this that rarely gets explained simply. Repeated spikes don't just stress the vessel wall once and stop, they also tend to feed back into the system that's supposed to control blood sugar in the first place. Each large spike asks the pancreas for a large burst of insulin in response, and over years, that repeated demand can wear down the very cells responsible for producing insulin, making the next spike a little harder to bring down than the one before. It's a slow, self-reinforcing cycle. Bigger spikes ask for bigger insulin responses, which over time become harder to sustain, which in turn can make future spikes even larger. An A1C, checked once a season, has no way of showing you that this cycle is even happening, because by the time it moves enough to be noticed, the pattern has often been building quietly for a long stretch of time already. Now let me show you how this same pattern reaches people who look nothing like Margaret, because if you think this only happens to careful gardeners in Oklahoma, you will miss it in yourself or in someone you love. Walter is 72, a retired mechanic outside Pittsburgh, built like someone who spent 40 years lifting engine parts and never once complained about his back. He was told years ago he had borderline sugar during a routine physical, and never took it especially seriously, the way a lot of strong, self-sufficient men don't take a soft warning seriously until something forces the issue. His fasting numbers usually ran in the 130s, high enough to matter, but never alarming enough for anyone to push hard on it at a 5-minute visit squeezed between two other patients. His after-meal numbers, when he finally checked them on his daughter's insistence, were regularly climbing above 250, sometimes higher after a big Sunday dinner. That combination, a persistently elevated fasting number stacked on top of a very high after-meal spike, is diabetes doing quiet, compounding damage in someone who has never technically been out of control enough to worry anyone at a glance. Walter didn't have a dramatic event, no ambulance, no emergency room. He had a small cut on his foot from a work boot that took 11 weeks to heal, a small wound that, in a body with healthy circulation and healthy nerves, should have closed in 10 days or less. Slow-healing wounds are a warning sign that circulation and nerve function in the extremities are already compromised, and roughly 1 in 4 people who develop a diabetic foot ulcer go on to face a more serious complication if the underlying pattern isn't addressed early and seriously. Walter's case is the one that shows you the warning sign doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's not a hospital visit. Sometimes it's just a wound that quietly refuses to close, month after month, while everyone assumes it's simply taking its time. Then there is Diane, 61, a retired librarian in Portland, meticulous by habit, the kind of person who still keeps a paper calendar. Diane's numbers looked good by every standard measure her doctor used. A1C of 5.9, comfortably in the non-diabetic range. Fasting sugar around 95, textbook normal. Her doctor would say excellent, and clinically, by the numbers he was trained to check, he wouldn't be wrong. But Diane had started checking her own sugar 2 hours after meals, out of simple curiosity after reading something online, and noticed something a single lab visit, taken once or twice a year, would never catch. Her after-meal number was slowly, steadily climbing. 130 in January, 145 in April, 165 in August. No single reading was alarming on its own. No single reading would have triggered a phone call to her doctor's office. But the trend, laid out across the year in her own notebook, was unmistakable. In someone in their early 60s, a rising after-meal number, specifically the trend over months, not any single snapshot, is one of the earliest markers that insulin resistance is quietly building underneath an otherwise normal-looking picture, often years before an A1C rises enough for anyone to officially notice or diagnose anything. Diane caught it because she watched the pattern accumulate over time, rather than trusting one good number. A modest change, mostly in meal composition, swapping some refined carbohydrates for more fiber and protein, and a short walk after dinner instead of sitting down immediately, and the climb stopped, then reversed over the following months. Diane is the case that proves the point of this entire video. The number that predicts complications is not the one on a lab printout once every 3 months. It is the one you watch quietly, patiently, after your plate is empty, day after day, month after month. There is one more case worth telling, because it shows you this pattern isn't only about the body, it's also about how families and even patients themselves sometimes misread their own numbers. Harold is 69, a retired postal worker in Albuquerque, and he is the case that surprises people the most, including his own son, who happens to be a nurse. Harold had lived with diabetes for over a decade and had, by his own account, gotten lazy about testing at home. He knew his A1C, checked twice a year at his doctor's office, hovered around 7.2, a little high but nothing anyone treated as an emergency. What Harold didn't know, because he'd stopped testing at home years earlier after his meter's battery died and he never replaced it, was that his after-meal numbers had drifted into a genuinely concerning range, regularly climbing above 280 after his usual dinner of pasta and bread. His son, visiting for a holiday, borrowed a meter from a pharmacy out of curiosity more than concern, and was alarmed enough by the reading to insist Harold start tracking properly again. What made Harold's case different from Margaret's, Walter's, and Diane's is that his A1C wasn't quietly hiding anything, it was already known to be elevated. The real danger was that everyone, Harold included, had mentally filed his diabetes under already being managed, simply because he was on medication, and saw his doctor twice a year like clockwork. Nobody was actively watching the after-meal number, because the assumption was that the medication was handling it. It wasn't, not fully. Harold's case is the reminder that being diagnosed and being on medication doesn't automatically mean the spike is under control. It means the average is being watched. The spike needs its own separate, ongoing attention, even years into treatment, even when you feel like you've already done the responsible thing by starting medication in the first place. 4 people, a careful gardener whose calm average hid years of daily spikes, a strong stoic man whose slow-healing wound was the first real warning his body could offer, a younger retiree whose rising trend no annual visit would ever have flagged in time, and a longtime diabetic who assumed his medication was handling a problem it had never fully addressed. Different bodies, different decades, different starting points, but the same overlooked number sitting quietly at the center of all 4 stories. So here is exactly what to do, in this order, starting this week, not next month, not after your next appointment. First, get a simple blood glucose meter, even if you are not on insulin, and even if your doctor has never suggested you need one. A basic meter costs roughly $15 to $25 at any pharmacy, and test strips are the main ongoing cost, usually a modest monthly expense. This is the foundation for everything else, because as you saw with Diane, the lab visit misses the trend entirely, and the trend is where the real information lives. Second, measure correctly, because measuring wrong is the mistake that makes your own numbers lie to you, and this is promise number 5 paid in full. Test right before your typical meal to get your baseline, then again exactly 2 hours after your first bite, not after you finish eating, after you start, since that's the standard window used to judge a post-meal response. Use the same finger each time if it's easier for you. Wash your hands with warm water first, since cold hands or residue from fruit or food on your fingers can skew a reading upward or downward without you realizing it. And don't test right after exercise or a hot shower, both of which can temporarily lower the number and hand you a falsely reassuring result. Write down both numbers, before and 2 hours after, for your 3 largest meals of the day, across a full week, so you start to see a real pattern rather than a single lucky or unlucky reading. Third, calculate your after-meal spike, the single number that ties this whole picture together. Subtract your before-meal number from your 2-hour number. In an adult over 60, a spike consistently above 50 to 60 points deserves a real conversation with your physician, and a 2-hour reading consistently above 180 deserves a more urgent one. If you're reading 110 before lunch and 210 2 hours later, that is a spike of 100, worth bringing up even though your fasting number alone, sitting at a calm 110, might never have raised a flag with anyone. Fourth, bring the numbers, not the worry, to your next appointment and ask 3 specific questions that force the conversation forward. Question 1. Given my age and health, what should my after-meal number actually be, and are we tracking it, not just my A1C? Question 2. Is my after-meal spike, based on the numbers I've brought you, in a range that concerns you? Question 3. Could my current meal timing, meal composition, or medication schedule be making this spike worse than it needs to be? Bring your printed week of readings on paper. A printed log turns you from a patient with a vague worry into a patient sitting across from the doctor with an actual data set, and that changes the tenor of the conversation more than almost anything you could say out loud. Fifth, know the 3 groups for whom the standard target is wrong, adjusted, or simply different. This is promise number 3. Group 1, adults over 75 or anyone with a history of falls, where pushing blood sugar aggressively low in pursuit of a perfect number raises the real risk of a dangerous hypoglycemic episode, a low blood sugar crash that can itself cause a fall, a fainting spell, or worse, especially overnight when nobody is watching. Group 2, people with existing kidney disease, who often need an individualized, more relaxed target because their kidneys are already handling less margin for error, and overly strict control can strain a system that's already compromised. Group 3. Anyone on insulin or certain other diabetes medications like sulfonylureas, where chasing a perfect after-meal number without carefully adjusting timing and dosing can swing them too low a few hours later, which carries its own serious risk in older adults, sometimes a more immediate risk than a moderately elevated sugar ever would. For these 3 groups, lower is not always better. It can, in the wrong circumstances, be the trigger for a different and more dangerous emergency entirely. There's a 6th practical step worth adding, even though it wasn't one of the 5 promises. Pay attention to which meals produce the biggest spikes, not just the number itself. Most people find that 1 or 2 meals a day, often the ones heaviest in refined carbohydrates, white rice, white bread, sugary drinks, account for the majority of their worst spikes, while other meals barely move the needle at all. You don't need to overhaul your entire diet overnight. Identifying the 1 or 2 repeat offenders in your own week, the specific meals that show up again and again with the highest 2-hour numbers, gives you a small, manageable place to start, rather than a vague and overwhelming instruction to eat healthier. A short walk of even 10 to 15 minutes after one of those heavier meals can meaningfully blunt the spike that follows, simply because moving muscle pulls glucose out of the bloodstream without needing extra insulin to do it. Now, before we finish, the part I promised to come back to, the thing some health articles get backwards. They will tell you reassuringly that if your A1C is in range, you don't need to worry about the rest, that the average is the whole story. That advice is half right and dangerously incomplete. In someone with a naturally steady metabolism and healthy blood vessels to begin with, that may hold true. But in someone over 60, whose small vessels already have less reserve and less ability to recover from repeated stress, a calm-looking average can sit directly on top of daily spikes doing real, cumulative damage the entire time. The very same A1C means 2 genuinely different things in 2 different bodies, and the reassuring version of the advice flattens that difference into one cheerful, forgettable sentence. That is exactly the trap Margaret's chart fell into, appointment after appointment. An A1C that would have told the whole story at 45 was quietly hiding something important at 66. I have put together a free 1-page resource called the After Meal Tracker. It's a printable log with the correct testing times marked clearly, a built-in spike calculator so you're not doing subtraction in your head, and the 3 questions to bring to your doctor printed right at the bottom of the page. You can get it at the link in the description below. It's free, there is nothing to buy, and it's designed to be the single sheet you bring folded in your pocket to your next appointment. If this helped you understand a number your own meter, or your own body, has probably been showing you for months without anyone pointing it out, the most useful thing you can do is hit the like button and subscribe, because every subscriber helps this reach one more person over 60 who was told their numbers were fine when the full picture was more complicated than that. And if you have a parent, a spouse, or a neighbor managing diabetes or prediabetes, send them this video today, before their next appointment, so they walk in already knowing to ask about the after-meal number instead of nodding along at the A1C and moving on. This video is for education only and is not medical advice. Please talk with your own physician about your specific situation before making any changes to your diet, testing routine, or medication. I'll see you in the next one.